The silence in Lena's study was a textured, palpable entity, woven from the faint, vanilla-sweet scent of decaying paper, the soft, rhythmic sigh of the old radiator in the corner, and the precise metronomic click of her ergonomic keyboard. Before her, illuminated by the warm pool of a halogen lamp, lay a fragment of a 12th century psalter, its Latin script faded to the color of dried blood, of old tea. Her task, as always, was an act of delicate excavation, to translate not merely the words Dominus illuminatio mea, but the faint, anxious tremor in the scribe's hand on the D, the shadow of a doctrinal doubt whispered in a cramped marginal note. This was her kingdom, the silent, reverent bridging of chasms between languages, between centuries. It was a kingdom that mirrored, with an almost terrifying symmetry, the quiet, well-ordered realm of her life with Daniel. Daniel was a senior archivist at the university's rare manuscripts library. His love was not a roaring fire. It was the steady, dependable glow of banked coals, warm, enduring, and contained. He remembered her preference for chamomile tea with a whisper of honey after 8 p.m., the specific brand of Japanese pigment ink she favored for her own notes, and maintained a meticulously detailed 10-year plan that included her tenure track, his eventual directorship, and a lovingly restored stone cottage in the Cotswolds with a dedicated climate-controlled room for their combined libraries. Their love was a priceless, well-preserved manuscript, vellum strong, illuminated with shared memories, its meaning clear, and its future secure. It was profound. It was safe. It was, Lena had begun to fear in her most secret heart, a language she could pronounce with flawless fluency, but whose poetry had quietly evaporated from her soul. The fissure in this impeccable world appeared not with a quake, but with the soft chime of an email arriving in her professional inbox on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The subject line was stark: Urgent Translation Project, Private Commission, Discretion Required. It was from Dr. Alistair Finch, a revered former professor now emeritus. The message was uncharacteristically brief. A reclusive, independent historian of some repute, a man named Arlo had finally completed his magnum opus, a dense, sprawling, philosophically charged history of forgotten European borderlands, and required a translator of rare skill to render it from a complex blend of academic German, idiosyncratic English, and lyrical personal digression into coherent, publishable prose. The compensation, Finch noted, was exceptionally generous. The deadline was unforgiving. The caveat, buried in the final line, was the key. He is particular, a mind of brilliant, uncompromising depth. Tread softly. Arlo refused to work within the sterile, fluorescent confines of the university. His instructions, relayed through Finch, were explicit. She was to come to him, to the source. His home was a converted 17th century stone barn perched on the wild, heather-clad shoulders of the northern moor, a drive of precisely 1 hour and 17 minutes from the city's orderly edges. The text and its physical context are inextricable, the directions stated, with no further explanation. Daniel, ever the pragmatic supporter of her career, had simply squeezed her shoulder. It's a prestigious commission, love. The drive is a nuisance, but the reference will be invaluable. Just promise you'll be careful on those roads after dark. Her first pilgrimage was on a cold, bright Tuesday in March, a day of sharp shadows and a wind that spoke endlessly of empty spaces. The barn stood utterly alone at the end of a rutted track, a huddle of gray stone against a vast sky the color of tarnished pewter. He opened the heavy oak door before her gloved hand could make contact with the iron knocker, as if he had been standing there waiting. He was not what she had pictured from Finch's vague warnings. Younger, perhaps in his late 30s, with the lean, tensile build of a distance runner or a man who thought best while moving. His face was all interesting angles, weathered not by age but by exposure, and his hair was an untidy mix of dark brown and premature gray, like lichen on stone. His eyes were the pale, clear blue of a winter lake, holding a startling, unnerving directness. He wore a heavy cable-knit sweater of undyed wool, frayed at the cuffs and boasting a small hole at one elbow. He did not offer a smile of greeting. "Lena," he stated, the word a flat declaration, not a question. His voice was lower than she expected, with a gravelly undertone that seemed formed by seasons of shouting into the wind or perhaps by long silences. "You're punctual. The study is through here." He turned and she followed him into the heart of the barn. The space was not a room. It was a cognitive landscape, a physical extension of a singular, obsessive mind. One entire curved wall was a vast, detailed ordnance survey map of the region, transformed into a tactical board pockmarked with a galaxy of color-coded pins, linked by strands of red thread, annotated in a minute, energetic script. Books rose in teetering geological strata from the flagstone floor. The massive oak desk was a continent of chaos. Open folios, dog-eared notebooks, sepia-toned photographs of overgrown ruins, shards of pottery nestled in labeled boxes, and half-empty mugs holding cold tea. And in the center of this glorious maelstrom sat the manuscript. It was not a tidy stack of A4. It was a mountain of loose-leaf paper, perhaps 500 sheets, each covered in a torrent of dark blue ink from a fountain pen. The handwriting was tight, angular, impatient, crawling with furious cross-references, arrows, and small, deft sketches of landforms in the margins. "I don't work with machines," Arlo said, following her stunned gaze. His tone held no apology, only statement of fact. "The hand forms a pact with the thought. The screen mediates, and in mediating, it betrays. Begin at the beginning. Interrupt when you are lost. There is no shame in being lost here. The territory is deliberately obscure." He prepared strong black coffee in a chipped enamel pot on a small gas ring, the process silent and efficient. Placing a heavy mug before her on the scarred translation table, a beautiful ancient piece of oak, its surface stained with generations of ink. He seemed to then forget her existence, retreating to a high stool by the map wall to pore over a series of grainy aerial photographs. Lena sat, her sleek silver laptop an arrogant, alien artifact in this temple of analog thought. She opened the first page, her heart thrumming with a strange cocktail of professional anxiety and thrilling intimidation. The title was written in a larger, bolder hand. "Über die Melancholie der Grenzen. Gräben, Mauern und das Gedächtnis des Grases." On the melancholy of boundaries. Ditches, walls, and the memory of grass. The work was not history as she knew it. It was a lament, a love song, a philosophical inquiry etched in landscape. He wrote not of kings and treaties, but of Saxon field boundaries visible only from the air in the low slant of a winter dawn, of the crumbling concrete shells of Cold War listening posts being tenderly devoured by blackberry brambles, of the psychic weight carried by a single ancient hedgerow that had marked a parish line for 800 silent years. His language was dense, elusive, metaphoric to the point of poetry. It did not merely describe. It invoked, conjured, haunted. Translating it was not an act of lexical substitution, but of profound channeling. She had to locate the living nerve endings of his sentences and attempt to graft into her own linguistic flesh. At the end of that first intellectually exhausting day, her mind felt bruised, stretched in new and uncomfortable ways. He walked her to the door, the late afternoon light slicing through the dusty air in solid golden bars. As she pulled on her coat, he spoke abruptly, not looking at her. "You hesitated this afternoon, on the word Sehnsucht." She paused, startled. "It's a notoriously difficult word. Yearning, longing, nostalgia, none are perfect." "It is the specific pain of a compass needle," and he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening line of the moor beyond the window, pointing with absolute conviction towards a magnetic north that has long since ceased to exist. "That is the sentence. Your task is to find a way to make that pain legible in English." On the long drive back to the city, to Daniel and their warm, tastefully lit apartment, smelling of lemon polish and that evening's roasted chicken, the phrase echoed, a ghost in the shell of her car. A magnetic north that no longer exists. It described with a precision that felt almost violent the quiet, persistent ache that had taken up residence in her own center. She had never found words for it before. She returned twice a week, a new rhythm establishing itself. The work was the most formidable challenge of her career. Arlo was a demanding, often irascible collaborator. He could spend an entire afternoon debating the cultural and etymological connotations of a word like Feldmark, the open field system, or Wüstung, a place that has become a desert, a settlement abandoned. He spoke of history as a palimpsest, not of parchment, but of land itself, each layer of sediment holding the ghost whispers of different loves, losses, and laws. He was brilliant, mercurial, and utterly consumed by the grand, lonely architecture of his vision. Slowly, painstakingly, a fragile, word-focused intimacy began to knit itself in the space between them. During their intense, sometimes heated debates over syntax and semantics, he began, almost imperceptibly, to turn the inquiry towards her. Not her credentials, but her mind. Did she believe a landscape could be a repository of memory? Was forgetting an active, political act? What was the untranslatable word for the particular quality of silence found in certain ancient libraries? Lena, who was used to being the invisible conduit, the clear pane of glass through which meaning passed, found herself speaking aloud thoughts she had never before articulated, even to herself. With Daniel, conversations were a comfortable exchange of logistics, affectionate reminiscence, and gently calibrated future plans. With Arlo, it was an excavation of the raw, unprocessed material of being. She was translating his life's work, and in the process, he was giving voice to the silent, yearning text of her own interior life. One rain-lashed afternoon in April, the wind howling around the stone barn like a banshee, she was wrestling with a particularly abstruse passage on the architecture of absence. Frustration, a rare visitor to her usually patient process, finally boiled over. She pushed back from the oak table with a sharp sigh. It's impossible. It's like trying to capture smoke in a sentence. Ari, he was standing by the small leaded window, watching the storm tear at the heather. Without turning, he said, "Read it to me. The English. Read it aloud." Self-conscious, her throat suddenly dry, she began. Her voice, initially clinical and professional, slowly began to warm to the strange, rolling cadence of his ideas, to catch fire from the passion in his metaphors. She filled the room with his thoughts, filtered through her voice. When the last syllable fell, the space was silent, but for the relentless drumming of the rain on the slate roof. He turned from the window. The quality of his gaze had changed. The usual analytical sharpness was still there, but beneath it swam something deeper, more unsettled. "You didn't just translate it," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You understood it. You heard the music in the chaos. You gave it a voice I wasn't sure it could possess." The compliment was not professional flattery. It was a revelation, a lightning strike that illuminated the dim landscape of her self-doubt and set it ablaze. In that moment, she felt more profoundly seen, more thoroughly comprehended in her essence than she had in a decade with Daniel. The air between them, thick with the smell of damp wool, old ink, and brewing storm, seemed to crackle with a new and dangerous voltage. The first touch was an accident born of scholarly proximity days later. Reaching simultaneously for the same heavy German lexicon, their hands brushed on the worn leather spine. A simple transfer of static, a tiny spark. They both froze. His hand was large, the knuckles prominent, the fingertips stained with permanent blue ink. The sensation was not a spark, it was a current. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers turned, just for a heartbeat, to curl around hers, a silent, fierce acknowledgement of the connection that had just arced between them. She pulled her hand back, as if from a live flame. Her breath caught somewhere high in her chest, her pulse a wild, frantic percussion against her ribs. He simply retrieved the book, his expression unreadable, but a faint flush colored the line of his cheekbones. The affair, then, began not with a passionate kiss in the rain, but with that shared, electrified silence over a dictionary. It was conducted in the language of glances, held a moment too long over the manuscript. In the charged quiet that followed a particularly bruising intellectual clash, in the way he would place a fresh mug of coffee by her elbow, his finger lingering against the ceramic in a ghost of a caress. The lies she spun for Daniel were small, logical extensions of her work. The manuscript's structure is more labyrinthine than we thought. He's uncovered a new cache of letters. It requires immediate integration. The light is better for my focus out there. Daniel, whose world was built on the integrity of records and the trustworthiness of sources, accepted the facts she presented. His unwavering faith became the pristine vellum upon which she, with growing dread and desperate exhilaration, inscribing her invisible, traitorous script. Nearly a month into the project, on a day of scudding clouds and sudden brilliant sunlight, Arlo declared, "The text is suffocating in here. It needs the wind on its skin. Come, I'll show you the ditch that birthed the third chapter." They walked for over 3 hours, following the faint, sinuous ghost of a medieval boundary ditch across windswept hills. He spoke not as a lecturer, but as a medium. He talked of the calloused hands that had dug it, the generations of border disputes it had silently arbitrated, the specific ecology of wildflowers Batoni, devil's bit scabious, harebell that now thrived in its sheltered bed. He was a different man outside, looser, his thoughts flowing as freely as the cloud shadows racing over the land. On the crest of the highest hill, with the world falling away in a patchwork of field and forest and distant hazy towns, he stopped. The wind tore at his hair and his words. "This," he said, his voice full of a raw, unshielded reverence that stole her breath, "is the only sentence I have ever truly wanted to write. All the rest is just footnote." Then he turned that reverence on her. When his mouth found hers, it was not like any kiss she had ever known. It was not Daniel's soft, familiar, affectionate press. It was the first rough translation of a primal, forbidden word. It tasted of bitter coffee, of wild, cold air, of intellectual fervor, and of a devastating, unvarnished truth that shattered the carefully curated museum of her life. It was an act of mutual discovery, of collision, of absolute, terrifying recognition. After that, the stone barn became their secret, sovereign nation. Their physical relationship was a direct, intense extension of their mental union, a meeting of fierce, hungry minds that happened to be clothed in urgent, straining flesh. With Arlo, Lena felt like a dormant, cryptic scroll being patiently, brilliantly, ruthlessly unfurled and deciphered. She was awake, terrifyingly alive, every nerve ending singing with a painful, glorious clarity. The guilt she carried for Daniel was a cold, steady undercurrent, a lead weight in her gut during the drive home. But the gravitational pull of Arlo's world, a world of uncompromising passion, of meaning wrestled from the soil, of existing squarely in the terrifying, wonderful present, was a riptide that dragged her under every time. At home, she became a masterful forger, a ghost haunting her own life. She moved through the rituals of her partnership with Daniel, the shared meals, the weekend films, the planning for a summer holiday in Tuscany, with a performance of normalcy so flawless it felt like a separate, exhausting profession. Her soul, however, remained on the moor, tangled in ink-stained sheets and the scent of peat smoke, echoing with his words. She tried in the early evenings to share some polished fragment of Arlo's historical insight with Daniel, but his eyes, kind and attentive, would inevitably glaze over after a few sentences. He was interested in her success, in the contract and the credit, not in the seismic, soul-altering process the work had become. The inevitable crisis crystallized around the manuscript's penultimate chapter. It was entitled simply The Interior Border. It explored the most personal and treacherous of all frontiers, the one constructed within the self, the wall behind which we garrison our most authentic name, our truest voice. Arlo had written, "The most heavily fortified boundary is never marked on any state cartographer's map. It is the silent, shifting frontier we build within our own chests, behind whose ramparts we lock away the self we fear to speak, the love we dare not name, the compass pointing to that extinct north." Reading the final draft of her translation at the oak table, Lena was ambushed by a wave of emotion so violent it left her gasping. She put her head in her hands and wept, silent, wrenching sobs that shook her shoulders. He found her like that, a vessel overflowing with a sorrow she could no longer contain. He did not speak. He simply crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, his large, ink-stained hands coming to rest on her forearms, his touch both an anchor and a brand. Lena. Her name in his rough voice was a confession. "I am living inside your chapter," she choked out, the words torn from her. "I have built that fortress. With Daniel, I am a faithful, elegant translation of the woman I believe I am supposed to be. A perfect, readable edition. But with you, I am the original, chaotic, flawed manuscript. And the dissonance, it is tearing me in half." He rested his forehead against her shoulder, his breath warm through the thin cotton of her blouse. The gesture was one of shared defeat, of profound understanding. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice muffled against her. "Then surrender the garrison. Lay down your arms. Stay. The book is nearly finished. Stay here with me. We will write what comes next together." It was the offer of a lifetime, of a different life entirely. To abandon the safe, annotated, predictable narrative for one of radical, uncertain truth. To choose the wild, unbounded moor over the quiet, climate-controlled archive. To trade a love that was a sanctuary for a love that was a revolution. "I love him," she whispered, a statement of tragic, irreducible fact. "I know," Arlo replied, the words raw and heavy. "But do you love the life you have built with him? Or are you merely its chief curator, its most devoted archivist?" She had no answer. The weight of the choice, of the imminent, total loss it guaranteed, paralyzed her. The final, unraveling thread was pulled not by passion, but by the quiet, methodical mind of the archivist she had left behind. Daniel, the man who trusted records, began to notice anomalies in the date of her life. The mileage on her car consistently exceeded the logical sum for the direct route to the moor and back. A receipt for a specific brand of motor oil, purchased from a garage in a village 30 minutes out of her way, fluttered from the pocket of her waxed jacket. Then, one still, terrible night, as she slept fitfully beside him, haunted by Arlo's words and her own duplicity, her phone, charging on her nightstand, buzzed with a single incoming text. The screen lit up the dark room. Daniel, awake and staring at the ceiling, saw it. The sender was not a saved contact, but the preview of the message was starkly visible in the blue glow. The final page is blank. "I cannot write the concluding line without knowing if your hand is holding the pen beside mine." The breakfast table the next morning was a courtroom. The silence was no longer companionable. It was accusatory, thick with the dust of shattered assumptions. Daniel looked years older, his face pale and drawn, the skin around his kind eyes tight and bruised from lack of sleep. He did not touch his toast. "Who?" he began, his voice horrifyingly calm, devoid of all its familiar warmth. "Is Arlo?" The sound of that name, the secret, resonant core of her hidden world spoken aloud in their sunny, tidy kitchen, was a detonation. All the oxygen seemed to vanish. The world narrowed to the grain of the pine table, the drip of the tap, the devastating flatness in his eyes. Every instinct screamed to lie, to construct a plausible story about a demanding, poetic client, about the metaphorical language of academia. But under the sheer unbearable weight of his quiet, utterly devastated gaze, and the exhausting, soul-crushing burden of the double life she had been leading, the truth was the only thing left that had any integrity, however terrible. "He is the historian," she said, her own voice sounding thin and far away, the voice of a stranger narrating a tragedy. "The man who wrote the book. I have, I have fallen in love with him." Daniel did not flinch. He did not shout. He made a small, choked sound in the back of his throat, the sound of a man internally collapsing. He stared at her, his eyes moving over her features as if he were re-authenticating a document that had just been revealed as a brilliant, heartbreaking forgery. "For how long?" The question was methodical, a historian establishing a timeline. "Months." The word was a pebble dropped into a bottomless well. He nodded slowly, a man processing irrefutable, catastrophic data. "And this person you are with him, this is the definitive text? The original, unedited version of Lena Caro?" The clinical precision of the question, the archival metaphor turned against her, was more cruel than any shouted curse. It laid the mechanism of her betrayal utterly bare. "I don't know," she whispered, the tears coming now in a hot, silent flood, dripping onto the untouched tablecloth. "Daniel, I am so desperately sorry. I never ever wanted to cause you this pain." "But you have," he stated, the words simple, final, and absolute. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping the floor like a scream. He stood, his movements stiff, robotic. "You have vandalized our archive, Lena. You took a shared history, a life we were writing together line by line, and you interpolated a foreign narrative. You made our truth into a palimpsest, and you scraped me away." He walked to the window, his back to her, his shoulders hunched as if against a physical blow. "You need to leave. Today. Now. I cannot, I cannot look at you in this space. It is all contaminated." She packed a single suitcase in a haze of surreal, bone-deep grief, her hands moving automatically. She did not drive towards the moor. She checked into a bland, anonymous chain hotel on the ring road, the epitome of transient nowhere. From the sterile room, she texted Arlo, "Daniel knows everything. It is over here." His reply was swift, a lifeline thrown into her private sea of despair. "Then come home. The barn is your home now. Come." For a week she did. She tried to lose herself in the final, meticulous proofreading of the manuscript, in the fierce, all-consuming reality of Arlo's world. But she was a ruin, a city after a siege. She missed, with a physical ache that surprised her, the deep, quiet peace of her life with Daniel, its routines, its unspoken understandings, its gentle predictability. The wild, breathtaking beauty of the moor began to feel stark, desolate, the silence not liberating but isolating. Arlo, for all his genius and passion, inhabited a realm of grand ideas and raw emotion. He was not equipped, nor was he inclined, to manage the mundane, devastating wreckage of her practical betrayal, the guilt, the logistical disentanglement, the sheer mess of it. Their conversations, once thrilling duets, became strained, circling arguments about an uncertain future. "I am not a safe harbor, Lena," he said one evening, his face etched with frustration as she voiced a fear about finances, about where she would live long term. He paced before the fire like a caged wolf. "I am the open, uncharted sea. I thought that was what you were sailing towards. I cannot suddenly become a marina." "I thought so too," she cried, wrapping her arms around herself. "But my ship is broken, Arlo, and I am drowning." The realization, when it came, was mutual, and it was a quieter, deeper devastation than any dramatic fight. She had mistaken the electrifying, transformative process of being deciphered by him for a sustainable love. He had been the brilliant, relentless key that had unlocked her most secret vault. But he was not, and could never be, the home for the fragile, complicated self that emerged. She loved him, but she could not live with him. in the daily ordinary sense of the word. Her love for Daniel, meanwhile, had been of the hearth and the home. She had taken its warmth for granted until she had chosen to freeze. She left the stone barn for the final time on a still, pearly gray morning in early May. The completed manuscript, now a coherent, towering stack of typed pages, resting beside the original, sat in a cardboard box by the heavy door. It was a masterpiece. It was also, she knew, the headstone of their impossible, beautiful collision. "You gave my work its true voice in the world," Arlo said, his own voice thick with an emotion he would not name. He stood in the doorway, not touching her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "For that, I will be forever in your debt. I am only sorry that my language offered no translation for the piece you needed." She found a small top-floor flat in a faded Georgian house near the university, its rooms filled with slanting light and the distant murmur of the city. She did not contact Daniel. The trust between them was a priceless, illuminated manuscript she had spilled indelible ink across. She could not ask him to pretend the stain was part of the original artwork. She took on smaller, quieter, freelance work corporate documents, the occasional dry academic article. The profound, soul-reshaping work with Arlo had forever spoiled her for the mundane, but it had also seared into her the catastrophic cost of such intensity. Nearly a year to the day after her world fractured, a parcel, wrapped in plain brown paper, arrived at her new address. Inside was a published copy of On the Melancholy of Boundaries. The cover was a stark, beautiful photograph of a forgotten ditch overgrown with grass. She opened it. On the half-title page in his unmistakable angular blue script, he had written, "For Lena, who translated the silence into the only song that mattered, with gratitude and an unmarked map." She traced the words with a fingertip, feeling the slight indent of the pen on the page. She had heard through the careful, pitying whispers of mutual acquaintances that Daniel had accepted a prestigious position as head archivist at a major institution in Canada. She hoped, with a pain that had matured from a sharp agony into a permanent, familiar ache like the phantom limb of a lost life, that he was building new, beautiful, orderly collections of truth, far from the wreckage she had made. One rain-softened afternoon, the silence in her new study was different. It was not the deep, collegiate silence of her old life, nor the charged, creative silence of the barn. It was her own, empty but full of potential. She opened a fresh, unlined notebook, its pages a blinding white. For the first time in her professional life, she did not begin to translate. Her pen, her favorite Japanese fountain pen, filled with the gray ink she loved, hovered over the void. She felt a tremor of the old fear, the urge to find an authoritative source, a text to mediate between her and the blankness. Then slowly, with a hand that shook only slightly, she began to write. Not a translation, not a commentary. Her own first, hesitant, original sentence. It was not elegant, it was not profound. It was awkward, a newborn thing taking its first breath. But it was hers. It was the long garrison self, finally, tentatively, speaking its own name, writing its own first, unedited word in the silent, waiting archive of a life she was now, for better or worse, authoring alone.